For over 50 years, Paul McCartney carried a secret that ate away at him every single day. The world knew him as the genius behind the Beatles. But what they did not know was the guilt he lived with about his youngest bandmate George Harrison. And when George took his final breath in 2001, Paul was left with words he never said, apologies he never made, and a friendship he destroyed with his own hands. But now, decades later, Paul McCartney is finally breaking his silence. And what he revealed will change everything you thought you knew about the Beatles. Before we dive into video, please subscribe our channel. Most people do not know this, but Paul McCartney and George Harrison were not just bandmates. They were childhood friends who rode the same bus to school in Liverpool every single morning back. In 1954, Paul was 12 years old and George was just 11. A skinny, quiet kid who hated school and dreamed of escaping the grey streets of post-war England. Paul noticed George on those bus rides because the younger boy always carried a guitar or talked obsessively about music while other kids were focused on football or girls. George was sketching guitars in his notebooks and practicing chords until his fingers bled. Paul saw something in him, a hunger that matched his own. When Paul joined John Lennon's band the Quarrymen in 1957, he immediately thought of George as the missing piece, but John did not want him. John thought George was too young, too inexperienced, too much of a kid, but Paul fought for him. He convinced John to at least give George a chance, and one night on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus, George played a song called Raunchy note for note perfectly, and John could not argue with that. That moment changed music history forever, because Paul believed in George. When no one else did, Paul was the one who brought George into the Beatles. Paul was his champion, his big brother, his protector. But as the years went on, that dynamic would become the very thing that destroyed their friendship. In the early days of the Beatles, everything was magic. 4 working-class kids from Liverpool conquering the world together, sharing hotel rooms, sharing dreams, sharing everything. But by 1966, something had shifted. Paul McCartney had become the leader, the creative force, the one pushing everyone forward, and George Harrison had become frustrated. You have to understand, George was writing incredible songs by the mid-1960s. Songs like If I Needed Someone and Think for Yourself showed he was maturing as a songwriter, but every time the Beatles went into the studio, it was John and Paul who got priority. George would bring in a song and Paul would take over, telling him how to play it, how to arrange it, how to make it better. George later admitted that Paul treated him like he was still that 11-year-old kid on the bus, like he had not grown up, like he was not capable of his own vision, and the worst part was, Paul did not even realize he was doing it to Paul. He was just trying to make the music better. But to George, it felt like suffocation. The breaking point started during the Sgt. Pepper sessions in 1967. That album was almost entirely Paul's vision. Paul was obsessed with making a masterpiece and he succeeded, but George only got one song on the entire album, Within You Without You, and even that was recorded separately from the band. George poured his heart into that song, exploring his new passion for Indian music and spirituality, but Paul barely paid attention to him. Then came the trip to India in 1968. George thought this would be transformative for all of them, studying meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, finding peace, finding purpose, but Paul treated it like a vacation. He joked around, got bored and left early. George was devastated. He later said that Paul did not take anything seriously except his own music. January 1969 is when the Beatles really started to die the Let It Be sessions were supposed to bring them back to basics, get back to their roots, but instead the cameras captured a band falling apart, and at the center of it was Paul McCartney bossing everyone around. There is footage from those sessions that is hard to watch. Paul is telling George exactly how to play his guitar parts, and you can see the anger building in George's face. Finally, George snapped. He told Paul, I will play whatever you want me to play, or I will not play at all. Whatever it is that will please you, I will do it. The sarcasm was dripping from every word. This was not a joke. This was years of resentment finally exploding. And what did Paul do? He barely acknowledged it. He just moved on. Like George's feelings did not matter. On January 10th, 1969, George Harrison quit the Beatles. He walked out during rehearsal and told them he was done. He later said, I had been thinking about it for a long time, and it was just a very unhealthy and unhappy environment for me. Paul and the others panicked. They realized they had pushed him too far. They begged him to come back, offering him more songs, more control, more respect. George did come back 12 days later. but something had broken that could never be fixed. He wrote a song that day called Wah Wah about the headache of dealing with Paul and the band. The lyrics were brutal, and everyone knew who it was about. Here is something most people do not know. In 1969, there was a private conversation between Paul and John that was recorded by a writer who was documenting the band. Paul told John, and I am quoting here, "Until this year, our songs have been better than George's. Now this year, his songs are at least as good as ours." Think about that for a second. Paul McCartney, one of the greatest songwriters in history, admitted that George had finally caught up to him and John. But notice the arrogance in that statement, "at least as good as ours," like it was some generous compliment. When George heard about this later, he was furious. He said, "I had been writing those songs for years." Paul just never bothered to listen. When Abbey Road came out in September 1969, it was George who stole the show. His two songs, Something and Here Comes the Sun, became instant classics. Frank Sinatra called Something the greatest love song of the century. Even John Lennon admitted it was the best song on the album, and for George, this should have been his moment of vindication. But it was not, because by then the Beatles were finished. Paul announced the breakup in April 1970, and George could not wait to get away from him when George released his first solo album, All Things Must Pass. Later that year, it was a triple album filled with songs the Beatles had rejected, songs Paul had dismissed as not good enough. The album was a massive critical and commercial success, and there was one song on it called Run of the Mill that had lyrics clearly aimed at Paul. "Everyone who runs your life, they do not know what they are asking. You have got me wondering how I lost your friendship." Throughout the 1970s, Paul and George barely spoke to each other. They would see each other at industry events, exchange awkward hellos, and move on in interviews. George was brutally honest about his feelings. He said he would happily play in a band with John again, but not with Paul. Those words destroyed Paul, even though he tried to act like they did not bother him. 1971, George organized the concert for Bangladesh, one of the first major charity concerts in rock history. He invited Paul to perform, but Paul said no. He gave some excuse about business complications, but everyone knew the real reason. He could not stand the idea of being on George's stage, playing George's event, following George's lead. That rejection hurt George deeply, because despite everything, despite all the years of being dismissed and controlled, George had still reached out, and Paul had slapped his hand away. The years went by, and they stayed distant. Paul built his new band Wings and chased commercial success. George dove deeper into spirituality and made music on his own terms. They were living parallel lives, never intersecting, never healing. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside his apartment in New York City, and suddenly Paul and George were left as the only two surviving Beatles, the only two people on Earth who truly understood what it had been like. You would think that would bring them together, but it did not. They grieved separately. They processed their trauma separately, and the wall between them stayed up. George later admitted he resented how Paul tried to take control of John's legacy, just like he had tried to control everything else in the Beatles. Through the 1980s, they remained distant, polite when necessary, but never close, never really brothers again. And Paul later said this was one of his greatest regrets, that he wasted years being stubborn and proud instead of fixing what was broken. In 1994, something incredible happened. Paul, George, and Ringo Starr reunited in the studio to work on old John Lennon demos for a documentary project called The Beatles Anthology. The press called them the Threedles, and for a moment it seemed like maybe they could find their way back to friendship. But even then, the old patterns emerged. Paul wanted to do things his way. George pushed back, insisting they needed an outside producer to keep things fair. George told Paul it could get dangerous, just the three of us, egos flying around. We need someone to referee. They managed to complete 2 songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love, but the sessions were tense. Paul later admitted they argued constantly about arrangements, about solos, about everything, but they got through it. And when it was done, there was a sense of closure. Not complete healing, but at least acknowledgement. George gave Paul a fir tree as a gift after those sessions, a simple gesture, but it meant something. It meant that despite everything, there was still love buried underneath all the pain. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer. He had been a heavy smoker for decades, and now it was catching up to him. He underwent radiation treatment, and for a while it seemed like he had beaten it. But then in 1999, a deranged man broke into his home and stabbed him repeatedly. George barely survived, and the attack left him weakened. Then the cancer came back this time, in his lungs and his brain. George knew he was dying, and he began reaching out to the people he loved, making peace, saying, "Goodbye." And that included Paul McCartney. Paul visited George several times in his final months, and these visits changed Paul forever, for the first time in decades. They really talked not about music or business or the past, but about life, about what mattered about love. Paul later described one visit to a hospital in New York where George was receiving treatment. Paul sat by his bed and they held hands. Two Liverpool lads who had grown up in a culture where men did not show affection, holding hands like brothers. Paul said they joked about old times, about nutty stuff, and for those few hours it was like they were kids again. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison died at a friend's home in Los Angeles. He was 58 years old, his body ravaged by cancer, but his spirit at peace. He died surrounded by people who loved him, chanting Hare Krishna and holding his hand. Paul McCartney was not there when George died, and that has haunted him ever since the day after George's death. Paul faced reporters outside his home in England trying to process the loss in real time. He could barely speak. He told them, "He is my baby brother, and I love him." And the look on his face was pure devastation. In the years since, Paul has opened up more and more about George, about the regrets he carries, about the things he wishes he had done differently. And this is where the real story begins, because Paul McCartney is finally breaking his silence about what really happened between them. In a 2020 interview, Paul said something he had never said before. He admitted that he was bossy during the Beatles years. He said, "I was guilty of telling George how to play his guitar parts, and I should not have done that. George was a brilliant guitarist, and I did not give him the respect he deserved." This was massive because for 50 years, Paul had downplayed. The tension had acted like everything was fine, but now he was owning his mistakes. He said, "George resented me, and he had every right to. I was pushy. I thought I was helping, but I was actually hurting him." Paul also revealed that in George's final months, George told him something that brought him to tears. George said, "I love you, Paul. Despite everything, I love you." And Paul said he broke down because he realized how much time they had wasted being angry when they could have been brothers. Paul admitted that he underestimated George for years. He said, "I thought of him as the kid, the baby Beatle, but he grew into this incredible songwriter and spiritual guide, and I was too blind to see it until it was almost too late." Paul still has that fir tree George gave him planted near the gate of his property, and he has said in multiple interviews that every time he walks past it, he says, "Hi, George," out loud. He said, "The tree is George to me. It is him still here, still growing, still part of my life." Paul also revealed that a few years after George died, the tree was destroyed in a storm, and Paul was devastated. But then he learned that the tree had not died from the storm, it had been killed by beetles of all things, and Paul said George would have found that hilarious. The universe playing a cosmic joke. Paul had the tree replaced with one from the same family, and he tends to it. Personally, he said, "Taking care of that tree is my way of taking care of George. My way of showing him the love I did not always show when he was alive." In recent interviews, Paul has become emotional, talking about George. He admits that he wishes he had been a better friend, a better brother. He wishes he had listened more, controlled less, shared the spotlight instead of hogging it. Paul said one of his biggest regrets is the concert for Bangladesh that he turned down. He said, "I should have been there, I should have supported him the way he supported me when we were kids, but my ego got in the way." He also admitted that George was right about a lot of things during the Beatles years. George wanted them to slow down, to focus on spirituality, to stop chasing fame, and Paul dismissed all of it. But now in his 80s, Paul sees the wisdom in what George was trying to teach. Then Paul said, "George was the most spiritually advanced of all of us. He understood things we did not. And instead of learning from him, I argued with him. I wish I could go back and just listen, really listen." Paul McCartney's willingness to finally be honest about his relationship with George matters, because it shows that even legends make mistakes. Even the greatest partnerships have pain and regret. Paul spent decades protecting the Beatles myth, but now he is telling the truth. And the truth is messy and sad and beautiful. George Harrison's son Donnie said in an interview that Paul calls him sometimes just to talk about George. And Donnie said you can hear in Paul's voice that he misses him, that he wishes things had been different. Paul also stays close with George's widow Olivia, showing that the bond between them all still exists. Paul has said that not a day goes by that he does not think about George, that he does not wish he could call him and tell him he was sorry, that he was right, that he mattered. And that inability to say those things is something Paul will carry for the rest of his life. The story of Paul, McCartney and George Harrison is not just about two famous musicians. It is about friendship and ego and the danger of taking people for granted. Paul had George in his life for almost 50 years, and he spent too much of that time trying to control him instead of celebrating him. But it is also a story about love. Because despite everything, despite the fights and the silence and the resentment, when it came down to the end, they still loved each other. They still held hands. They still said the words that mattered. Paul McCartney breaking his silence about George Harrison is his way of making amends, even though George is not here to hear it. It is his way of telling the world that George was not just the quiet Beatle. He was a genius, a spiritual teacher, a brother, and Paul failed him. But he loved him. And maybe that is the most human thing about Paul McCartney. Not his talent or his fame, but his ability to finally admit he was wrong. To finally say, I am sorry. Even if the person who needed to hear it is gone. What do you think? Should Paul have spoken up sooner, or does it matter that he is telling the truth now? And do you think George forgave him before he died? Drop your thoughts in the comments and make sure you subscribe, because next time we are revealing what really happened between John Lennon and Paul McCartney in their final phone call and why Paul has never fully recovered from it.